Welcome to the Leaders of Transformation podcast, the #1 show for business leaders and entrepreneurs passionate about uplifting others and making a greater impact in the world. Now, here's your host, transformational coach, speaker, and business advisor, Nicole Jansen.
How is the business balance between technology and humanity shifting right now? This is the Leaders of Transformation podcast, and on this show, we interview difference makers and world changers who are disrupting for good. I'm your host, Nicole Jansen, and our guest today is Deborah Westphal. She is a futurist, very interesting lady, and she has been challenging some of the top minds in the world about the way that business is done and how to change that. We're going to explore some of that today. We're going to talk about her book, which is called Convergence, Technology, Business, and the Human-Centric Future. Also, I want to do a shout out before we go any further to Andrew Gottlieb. He was actually on this show in episode 381 talking about business as a force for good. And he actually recommended Deborah. And I always want to do a shout out to those that are supporting the show. And that is you, of course, that is watching. It's also all the booking agents that send us guests. It's all the guests that send us other guests. And so we just really, really appreciate it. Now, this podcast is actually brought to you by my coaching and training company. And if you're a leader who wants to do better, be better, and make a greater impact in the world, I invite you to schedule a free consult with me. You can go to leadersoftransformation.com/coaching. And there's a schedule a link there to do that. And we can talk about what you're going through, what you're planning to do, what's going on with what your current situation is or your project that you're working on, and how we can help you to move forward and take it to where you want it to be. So with that, let's get into our conversation with Deborah, and let's bring her on. Deborah, welcome to the Leaders Transformation.
Hi, Nicole. I'm so excited to be here. Looking forward to this discussion.
Yes, me too. And I know there's been a little bit of time because of our backlog with guests. And so I'm glad that you're patient and allowing me to also get an opportunity to read your book. And so thank you for that. So let's talk a little bit more. I mentioned about you being a futurist and challenging the top minds, but tell us a little bit more about what you actually do and maybe even also where you got started.
So where I got started was I was an engineer, graduated with electrical engineering degree, and went into the Air Force as a civilian, working advanced concepts, advanced technology. And, from there, I spent a nice 13 years with really kind of walking in the future, thinking about big geopolitical things and technology evolutions. And at that pivot point of 13 years, I decided to join a startup that was being created by Alvin Toffler and his wife, Heidi Toffler. And their passion was to help people create the future, because we were moving from this industrial model of almost anything, how we make money, how we make products and services, to how we make war, to a very, information-centric world. And that was the right jump. I was employee number 6. And I spent 20 years with them, with helping organizations across the world, government, nonprofit, and for-profit businesses looking to create their future. So that's what brings me here today.
Alvin Toffler, I'm familiar with him, certainly not to the extent that you are, but familiar with some of his books and hearing about him and even just quotes. I mean, he's such a well-known futurist for those that are kind of in that space and looking for that. So what was it like to work with him? What were some of the conversations? Maybe kind of give us a little bit of a sense of, you and I were talking actually before we hit record and went live, is that, it's like the conversations that you have shape the way you see yourself, others in the world around you. It shapes your thought process and also expands you. And so to be able to bring what your ideas are to the table, and then with someone and a couple like that, I just think I would just love to be a fly on the wall to some of those conversations.
Yeah. Well, first of all, they were just incredible people and extremely, just good people. They would laugh a lot. That's the first thing, is that they were just amazing people. Curious. They were journalists. They didn't call themselves futurists. Other people put that tag on them. They were journalists. They, young in their careers, they wrote about everything, everything from politics to farming to household lady issues that around cooking to high technology. And it was really this curiosity and this breadth of trying to understand that gave them this view of, hey, there's something happening here and it's showing up in different places. The consistency was society is going to shift, that we are going to have this big evolution of advanced technologies. And what it will disrupt is people, societies, and really how we think about ourselves, think about our communities, think about our politics, think about our governments. And so many would like to attribute that he talked about technology, and he did. He foresaw this information age, but it was really the social disruption that we're all going through today that was really kind of that focus of the body of their work. So they're just
Yeah.
incredible. I miss them all the time. And it was just, they cared about people. They cared about people in our company and in their lives. And it was just really, the conversations were just wide ranging in what if.
Well, to me, when I think of like some of the questions that we ask ourselves, I noticed for myself when I was growing up, I started actually making statements and I would say, this is the way it is, or this is this. And then when I shifted that into asking questions and not just asking questions like, what's wrong with me or what's wrong with this, but looking at it from a what if standpoint, it opened up the possibilities to what I hadn't considered, what I hadn't thought of. And it expanded the, not just recognizing what the issue is, but the solutions that were possible. And it kind of like I could tap into that people call it the super conscious or the higher power or God or whatever. It was like, wow, I hadn't even thought of that. That what if is such a simple thing, but yet so powerful. And to your point about being a futurist and not calling themselves futurists, I was thinking about thought leaders. Now, today, the term is thought leaders. And honestly, I don't know a thought leader who actually set out to be a thought leader. They just thought differently and were curious and asked the questions and what if and why do we do it this way when, is that the best way to do it? Or maybe there's other ways to do it. And because and like what you also talked about, which I'm pointing these out also because for our listeners, is to start, these are simple things and yet profound things that we can apply in our lives today. It's like, what are the conversations? What are the questions that you ask yourself? What are you noticing? Like look at the world around you and tune in, not just to tune in to CNN, but to tune in to what's actually happening around you. Because when you do that and it's like, this is happening here and that's happening there and interesting. So there may be some trends or maybe some things to notice going into the world in the sense of tuning in will give you that insight. And then when you marry that with the what if, what if we actually did this differently? What if this wasn't the best way to do it? What could we do? So I love that. And you've got your book. So let's talk actually about your book, Convergence, because you address some of these things in the book. So why did you write the book? Tell us a little bit more about what the book is about and what people can expect.
So I wrote the book very much about what we were just talking about here. It's a what if. It's a challenge of our assumptions. I think, you talked about people kind of getting set in what their views are. I think people that know me very well, my close friends and my family members would recognize that when we go and say things like, well, it will never be, or it will always be, or it's going to continue, that's when I tend to kind of challenge because that absolute is always overturned. And so, the book is about the real shift that we're starting to see between these two major forces and the force of technology and advanced technologies in its ability to connect people, to analyze, to bring data to the forefront, and how that's really changing the way people interact and communicate and really in a lot of cases behave. We're seeing 5 billion people on the planet are all connected now, and the other 3 will be connected very soon when all this infrastructure from in space and such will be there for them. And, what that's allowing is for people to connect to people that are like them and share ideas and fears and hopes and dreams. And in some cases, I was in a conversation last week where there was an older gentleman saying, this is irresponsible. They're angry. Well, yeah, okay, this is a new capability that we have. Then, we got to kind of learn what our accountability is when we start putting things out there, and that will come, right? And so the technology is allowing humanity to shift and to demand other things. And they're demanding other things from businesses and the business leaders. And that to me is the third force that is really converging. And what do I mean by the demands for business is, there's such power and capability in a business that only having that focus on shareholders is now coming to question. It's more returning to what capitalism probably was, 60, 70 years ago, which said, we got to worry about our employees and we've got to worry about our environment. And it's a whole suite of stakeholders that we need to wrap into our thinking as we mature our businesses and execute on growth strategies. And so these things are coming together, and it's exciting, it's disruptive, and it can be very scary for some, but being aware that it's happening, and how do business leaders keep that in balance and think about that as they lead their organizations into the future is what's in the book. It's not a how-to book. It is definitely not a how-to book. It is a book to read and to, start to just question some of the assumptions that you may personally have, and dialogue with people inside or outside your organization as to what if and what should we and how could we. That's really the intent of the book.
Well, and I appreciate that, because sometimes it's like we dive right into the how, but you don't have the, like, again, coming back to the bigger perspective of let's just digest some of the concepts, and then we can start looking at the how to, so that they understand why the how to is so important. Let's talk a little bit more in depth about this idea. You talk about convergence, and there's like these three, you use the example, I think it's like of a river, of these three different things that are converging. So when we look at business today, and I love what you said also about capitalism, because a lot of times people, when you start getting into this human centric concept, people kind of sometimes, and I've had some guests and people that have asked to be on the show that start kind of going away from the capitalism, like capitalism is bad and this is the way we need to go. But I appreciate that you're like valuing what capitalism was actually meant to be, perhaps, and maybe they got a little out of control, or a lot out of control in terms of greed and corruption and all of that. But the premise is something that we can still build on. So can you talk a little bit about what you see in business right now and what we can expect it to be like, even more on a little bit more of on a granular level, what we can expect? And even as those that are listening, because we've got entrepreneurs that are listening, we've also got big business leaders listening, as to what they can be doing to start making the shifts and being prepared for the shifts that are to come.
Yeah. So the first thing is I'm very pro business and I'm a capitalist. I mean, I think there is definite power in thinking about a market and how do we grow economically, both, for our companies as well as the community at large. And it's a motivator. It's really, in my perspective, it is just taking a little bit more balanced look at not only what you're doing today, but that future market. If you do something to destroy, let's just take environment. If you do something to destroy the water source that you need, or the land that you're using, or the customers that you're supporting, you're not going to have a business in the future. And so it's the long view of business, and it's not the short term weekly, monthly gains that need to be considered. It's really that longer view. Post me being a CEO, I've got to think about the CEO after next, and the one after next with my decision making today. And so I think that's the first thing. I think it also is, there is a real richness when you start to really think about that balance of making money and then doing right for the environment or doing right for people, there are new opportunities that start to emerge that are business opportunities. Last week, Honeywell announced that they're getting ready to build a plant to start. They've got a new technique for recycling plastic and then turning it into that feed oil that can go into other new products. And so they're melting it down and using that, converting it to oil so that we can build more. It's a much more recycling process because today only about 2% of our plastics are recycled. And this may open that up for 50, 60, 70% of our plastics to be, which is incredible. Well, that's not just good for the environment, it's good for them economically too and financially as a business. And so I think it's just moving away from everything inside a business being just solely focused on maximizing profit for the shareholder, which is just for a few people, and start to ask the questions around, maximizing growth or wealth or value around stakeholders. And stakeholders traditionally have been customers, employees, your suppliers, the communities. And I open that up, the aperture to larger humanity, because some of these problems that we have really are not just in the communities that we operate. They are affecting communities, in distant parts of the world. For instance, our electronics or the batteries for electric cars, digging out the rare earth minerals for those batteries are going to affect places like Greenland. So we got to be not just concerned about us in the United States, but we should really be worried about those places too that are really in our whole supply chain.
So that was interesting that you mentioned that. And I don't know if people listening would be familiar with that. I didn't know that either. The impact on, let's say, Greenland, or that's happening. What are some of the other things that are going on that we might not be aware of that we take for granted? As consumers, we can be more informed about the decisions that we make. So there's the business that has the effect, but then there's the consumers that are supporting those businesses.
As I said, these are complex problems, right? We love electric cars, but they may not be as clean, quote unquote, as what we believe, because when you think about everything upstream, which is getting the minerals and mining them and building out those batteries, but then also downstream, what are you going to do with that? How will you recycle those? Are they going to end up in a landfill? Another is the idea of the internet and all of us being able to stay at home. And won't this be great? We won't have to travel and jump on airplanes, and it will just be so much better for our environment. Not necessarily. What the growth of the internet has done is it's also driving growth in data analytics and storage. Well, those are, data storage, and those data storage take energy, and energy can be very dirty. If the internet right now was a country, I think it is the sixth biggest polluter in the world. And, when we think about all these data storage facilities that will be created in the future, I mean, Google's putting underground cloud capability in the oceans. You wonder, okay, what's the impact of that? It's just a balanced look of what we are doing across that system of systems, if you would. We're still going to have growth. We're still going to have prosperity. We're still going to have things. But how do we think about them so that we're not inadvertently creating a problem somewhere else down the road? And I give other examples like that in the book, but that is a consumer. Do your homework and look for different sources to really start understanding the complexity, because these are not easy decisions, and they're not easy problems to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's the unintended consequences of our actions. And if we, even like I was talking about earlier, if we just start asking ourselves different questions and kind of tune in to what's going on, seems to be a theme in our conversations, just this idea of tuning in. And I love identifying trends and noticing what's happening. And I think that's really important. And part of the reason why I'm able to do that is because you're tuning into these and not just the immediate benefit of it, but what's the long-term impact of it. So that's really interesting. I'd love to shift gears here and talk about, so you alluded to it a little bit, solutions. So in this human-centric focus, you mentioned about technology and the internet and impact and so forth. What is the solution that you see that where we can go and how we can do this in a healthy, effective, profitable way? What does it look like for the leader in business that's saying, okay, I realize that maybe we need to take a closer look at this and minimize some of our tangible impact. But then it's also the human centric side of it, of like our workforce and how do we support our workforce and value humanity as opposed to just leaning on technology as being a driver of growth and innovation.
Yeah, so I think there's a danger of trying to maybe turn this into a banner and try and demand results too quickly. There was an interesting article out of HBR earlier on this year. A gentleman his name was Kenneth Pucker, that wrote this article that had been tracking for the last 20 years the amount of kind of corporate social responsibility reporting and the money that companies were saying that they were putting into those initiatives, whether that be environmental or social issues. And over 20 years, I mean, there was almost $30 trillion reported from companies that were saying, we are doing good work, right? Look at how we're doing this good work. Over that last 20 years, we've had a rise in carbon emissions. We've had more damage to the environment. The wage gap has accelerated between CEOs and the median worker. So you have to stop and consider, like, so what are we doing here? If we're doing all this good, why is it that we're still not doing good? Like, why aren't we reversing some of these issues? And so many of these things, you want to prove that you're listening and you're hearing, and your marketing and PR folks will start to tell those stories. But I think really this is the time for leaders to not try to take it all on, but to really find those one or two things that they can actually do and make an impact, and be transparent on those things and very transparent on the measures that they're measuring and hold themselves accountable to this and really speak truth with that transparency to start building trust that we're moving forward on the right path. I think there really is a danger, the G20 and everybody and the social, and we're seeing all this, and I'm watching Bloomberg the last couple of days and people are excited and everybody's trying to talk about what they're doing. Let's put the brakes on that a little bit and let's really be real about what we're doing. And that's going to mean you can't tackle it all. It may be one or two things. Let's start small, crawl before we can walk and run. And I think that is that shift that really needs to happen. And I do think your customers, for those that are listening out there, your customers are going to appreciate that a lot more because they're not stupid and they can see that maybe beyond the marketing and the PR, they can see and they will notice when solutions are really being hacked.
Yeah. So what I hear in that is be honest. There's that vulnerability again that Brene Brown's been talking about for years now, and that has really become a bit of a buzzword, or I shouldn't say but, and with that, yes, being vulnerable and saying we don't have it all figured out, but these are the things that we are looking at doing, and this is what we are working towards. And what I also heard in that was to do certain things, try to, rather than trying to do it all, do certain things really well. And then you can build on those things. And it's interesting because entrepreneurs, I've had recently a number of entrepreneurs or people that are aspiring to be entrepreneurs, and they come and they're like, well, I'm starting this business and that business and this business. And I said, well, wait, pick something, do that really well. And then you can add on, because there are, the concept of multiple streams of income is a popular thing, right? And it's wise. But you don't start all these things all at once, because then your focus is divided and you can't actually get good at all those things. It just takes longer. If you have three things, it's going to take 3 times longer, essentially, to get to a point of excellence in all three of those things, rather than taking taking all that focus and putting it into one area. Or, of course, if a company or organization has enough resources, they can maybe work multiple things, but be really more focused on that, is what I heard there. So,
Yeah, and you can, pick your platform. If it's water management, and you don't have a water management strategy, start there. And I think that is really up to the individual company. And entrepreneurs are different than more established companies, right? The established companies have all this momentum of doing it one way that they have to, kind of pivot around and really question. For entrepreneurs, start on that premise. Start with, how are you going to build that company that's responsible for your stakeholders, versus just coming right out of business school with this mindset of if it's just, around shareholders. Because ultimately, the companies that do have a broader purpose other than just making money for shareholders are the ones that are healthier businesses. And they're healthier businesses, and they last a lot longer than those that are just that flash in the pan, let's get rich. So, and I don't think entrepreneurs ever set out that way of we're just starting this company to make a lot of money. They start out with these big change the world ideas, and keeping that passion and that platform through their decision making as they grow will be very critical.
yeah. Speaking of which, actually, episode 400, I had Sir Ronald Cohen on this show, and he talked about, he's a venture capitalist, been very successful, and he got to that point of like, okay, what's this all for? And then became a pioneer for the social impact movement. And to your point, that's what he was talking about. He's like, these companies are actually more profitable. So if you want to be a profitable company going forward, if you want to maintain and to grow your market share, you will need to take into consideration these things that he talks about, that you're talking about here, about this human-centric focus, this greater perspective as to the impact that you're actually having in the world, not just the immediate make profit and everything else will have to take care of itself. This is our responsibility. If those of you that are listening, go check out episode 400. And of course, we've had tons of people on this show who have spoken about this in different ways. I say tons, but we have over 400 episodes of amazing difference makers and world changers who are speaking to the same topic in different ways, some more than others. And that's why that one in particular stood out for me as I was listening to you, Deborah, because you're so aligned. And it's such a confirmation. And here's somebody that's also speaks to and was on the task force, the G8, and all this sort of stuff. So he's seeing a lot more than the average person, just like yourself. Before we wrap up, I would love to talk a little bit about your love for travel, because you've been to some really interesting places in the world. And I know it's shaped a little bit of your perspective on it. So maybe talk about some of your favorite places and what's the value of travel as it relates to seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah, I think travel is such an important part of who I am. And that was even as a child. We moved around a lot in the United States. And as an adult, I've just expanded that to international travel. And it's so important. And really why it's important to me is when you go to a lot of these places, yes, they eat different food, and it's, they wear a little different clothes, or they have different cultures. But at the root of all these places that I have visited, there's a commonality across humanity. And people hope for the future. They hope better for their children. They worry about the same things that we worry about. And there's just a real collective feeling that I really get when I travel. I think travel also allows for dots to be connected that maybe you wouldn't have connected, or I wouldn't have connected in all the places I've been. I've just fully loved. Tibet was amazing, and Uganda. But one that is very much relevant to this discussion was a trip that I took in 2018 to the Antarctica. And my father had worked down there in the 1980s on a big radar project. So I wanted to go down and just see. And what I came away with is that area is so important to every person on Earth. It is 90% of it is ice. it holds 98% of the world's fresh water in those icebergs. It is now not, no one owns the Antarctic. There is, 50 some countries that have signed an agreement that said it is only for science. And so even though there is a one base that has multinational people living there, it's not a place where we inhabit so that we can protect it. In I think it's 2040, that agreement comes up, and there are people already wanting to exploit Antarctica for oil or build big hotels. We start doing that water, that ice, that puts us all in danger. And I would have never have made that connection unless I had traveled there. And so that goes back to some of the earlier things that we were talking about. Not everybody will be able to have the opportunity to go to the Antarctica, but listening and learning and connecting and really under the surface, understand, because at the end of the day, we're all a part of this global community. And we can't, just because we live locally doesn't mean that we have to impact globally. So I think that's what travel does for me. And I appreciate the question because it is a love and it is very important to me.
Wow. Well, and it's eye-opening to hear you even share that. That's really interesting. I had somebody on the show. Her name was Jennifer Smith, and she talked about the rainforest. And a lot of capitalists will say, oh, it's like the tree huggers are all worried about the thing. But yeah, the reality is, if you don't take care of the environment, if you don't take care of this planet, all the money in the world is not going to matter, bottom line. And it's interesting. I hear people say we need to take care of the planet. Well, yes, the planet's actually going to take care of itself. It might kick us off,
Right.
but it's going to be fine. So when it really comes down to it, this is a matter of self-preservation, and not just for the planet, but for like humanity, to protect our future and to create a world that our children and our children's children will have to be able to thrive in. So yeah, it's really, really important.
Just take the long view. Even if you're not bent that way in your thinking, and if you really do view it as tree huggers, just take a long view of your business, because through our strategic planning and our what ifs inside of corporations, we're always worried about our supply chains. We're worried about our electronics right now and the impact of making business or, making our products. Just have the same view about the environment and those other stakeholders as you would some of the other, critical, the way you define critical suppliers, because the earth is a critical supplier. And just take that long view and make your decisions today for today, as well as the longer view. So I think that's really, really how I would land.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's like, that's where all your resources come from. Hello. Just saying.
Yeah, just look out a few more years. Don't think that it's just, about the next 12 months. It really is. It is the next 5 or 10 years. And you don't have to look out hundreds of years, just the next 5 or 10, and make good decisions for it as well as, today.
So good. Deborah, thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing a little bit of your perspective on the long range. And you've had many, many years to explore and be in this conversation with some top leaders and hearing what's going on. So thank you. I appreciate you bringing a little bit of that perspective here today. And I would encourage our listeners to go get a copy of Deborah's book, Convergence, Technology, Business, and the Human-Centric Future. As well, you can go to her website, deborahwestphal.com. Convergenceishere.com is another website. And so I would encourage you to do that, learn more about it. Follow her on LinkedIn. We'll make sure all of this information is in the show notes. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have 400 plus other guests that have been on this show. And so you can find all of those episodes at theleadersoftransformation.com. And the cool thing about it is there's a search field. I so appreciate Harv Craven, who developed the website, because he created this search field where you can type in like futurist, or you can type in a particular topic. And if we've done an episode on it, it'll come up, and all the 400, it'll come up, and you can check those out. So we encourage you to go take advantage of that library that has been created over the last 6+ years through the conversations that we've had so you can learn and become the leader of transformation that you're capable of being. And with that in mind, next week, we're also going to have another amazing guest on this show. And so if you'd like to join us live, you can join us live on Tuesdays, or of course, it's going to be available on all your favorite podcast platforms and YouTube and all those good places afterwards as well. So again, thank you for being here. Deborah, thank you for being here. We look forward to seeing you all in the next episode of Leaders of Transformation real soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Leaders of Transformation podcast with Nicole Jansen. If you're enjoying this show, please click the follow or subscribe button and leave a rating and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And remember to join us on social and get connected. Together, we can make this world a better place for everyone. We'll see you next time.